Hello again. This is kind of like a quote. So we take Open Toolkit users, and if we asked them what they want, they would say they want dozen cats and a better properties file. But just like in screenwriting, we shouldn't confuse what the hero wants and what the hero needs. So we need to give them what they need. And like in screenwriting, the things hero wants are concrete, and the things hero needs are kind of abstract. This is what George actually covered yesterday in his talk about context. So if you were there, you already know this. If you didn't go there, you should get his presentation. So this is a lightning talk about the concrete things in Open Toolkit. Since OT is basically built on top of ANT, and arguments to Open Toolkit are ANT properties, you've always been able to use an ANT build file, build.xml, to define your argument properties and then call OTs and targets. And also has support for reading property files, Java property files, but they're not actually just property files because ANT is able to expand other properties in those values. A third way of calling ANT is to, or Open Toolkit in ANT, is to have some sort of batch file or shell script. You wrap around ANT and pass the arguments there, and you define them there. And that's, I suppose, the most manual way of doing automation. If we think of automation, that something that you don't need to always type in those arguments again and again. These are good ways of running Open Toolkit, but they have issues. So if you write an ANT build file, it's quite verbose. Not just because of XML, but you have to declare multiple things that are not just that thing that you're describing. And you can't reuse it in some other context because it's an ANT build file. It's like programming language called ANT in the end. The same goes for other procedural ways of passing arguments like shell script or batch files. You can't reuse them, even if they are less verbose. So in order to get a reusable configuration for running Open Toolkit, we need some sort of declarative way of declaring those properties or set of properties. But if you've ever used the properties file with ANT, you know that there are problems like with the relative paths. Sometimes you want to declare the value as being a relative path, but Open Toolkit accepts only absolute values there, so you kind of have a problem there. And we would like to make things easier. So, as of today, with 3.4, you have a feature called project files in Open Toolkit. If you look at the documentation, I think it says Open Toolkit project files. And in a way, they're specific to Open Toolkit, but only to a degree. Project files don't have variables and properties that you can find and reference them in other values. So in that sense, they're a bit less powerful than ANT property files. But again, with simplicity, hopefully becomes sort of ease of use. And we wanted to keep the initial set of features of these property files quite small, so we can build them to be something better or more complex later on when we find out what the actual need is for this use. What we do have is composability. So you can define your project in multiple files and combine them to then produce your sort of, well, context for your publication. So, terminology. That's basically the structure of a project. A project file is a file. It defines a project. And it appears I've deleted parts of my notes. Oh, that's bad. So a project consists of deliverables, which are basically like PDFs or HTML. That's a deliverable. But it doesn't have to be something like that. But you can think of context as something you would burn on a CD and send to your customer. And then a deliverable is consists of two parts, a context and a publication. George was already describing these things. Context defines your data source, which data source to use, and which filters to use to profile it. It doesn't list all your data files like a CMS export metadata file would. It just tells you what the start files are that you need to convert, just like in Open Toolkit usage. And then the filters, they're data val files that are used to profile the content. Then you have publication. I don't know which one of those it is. The publication just defines which trans types to use and which arguments to pass to that trans type. And fun fact or top tip, the publication part of project files is the only thing that's specific to Open Toolkit. Everything else is quite generic. And in addition to context and publication, you have one sort of thing in the middle saying where does the output of this deliverable go in your local machine, for example, a directory. And it's that simple. This is quite similar to what Oxygen's transformation scenarios are. Like if you read how it's stored on disk, how Oxygen writes it on disk, it's probably something like this. So visually you can think of this also as something that a transformation scenario would define. So not everyone wants to live with cats. Some like dogs instead. So this is the first time in OT's history that we're introducing a feature where we support multiple formats. So in addition to writing these project files in XML, which most of you probably are familiar with, we also allow you to write them in YAML and JSON. All the JavaScript developers love JSON, and all the cool kids like YAML these days. So, because XML as a language isn't really best for configuration files. It's quite verbose, and people like to scribble things, and that's why you have Markdown instead of just DITA. The XML files do come with some benefits. The tools allow you to validate them, like Oxygen does. The other formats, YAML and JSON, do have validation tools and so forth, but they're, I think, not as mature. But because we want to give options and maybe experiment a bit, what would be a nice language to write the configuration files in, we wanted to add this feature. So this is a concrete example of a YAML file, of a project file. The 3 dashes in the beginning just say that this is the start of the file. We define a deliverable, a context with input. Then I think there should be an indentation for the DITA-vals. This is somehow messed up. So we define a DITA-val to use for the conversion. We want the output directory to be the current directory. We define it to use HTML5 as the trans type and pass it a few parameters. The args.hdr, in this case, it's a reference to a file. So even though in this case we can write relative paths or relative URIs to resources, when this is read, that's sort of resolved against the location of this file on your disk. So relative paths are easier to use with this new feature. And then you have like navtoc, the value is partial. This is a bit more complex example, even though this one is shorter. And this is the XML format. So first we're actually defining something that's common. So we define the context of the deliverable to be a user-guide.data map with a profile. And then we give it an ID, HTML. And then we can include the comment.xml that we just saw. We can include that in another project file where we use it. There, in context ID ref HTML, we reference that common context. And then here, define the output and the publication information. Again, with properties. I think this looks fairly familiar to most people who've written ANT with OpenToolkit. Project files are supported by the OpenToolkit CLI. So instead of inserting your input and format and so forth, you just give it the path to the project file. And if you only want to get one of the deliverables, because you can specify multiple deliverables in a project, you can just say, I want this deliverable, and it'll convert it. If you don't, it'll process all the deliverables that are in the project file. What? Yeah, good. So, what more can we do with this if we want to adopt a really big cat? So this is the first iteration of the project. We would like to get some feedback to know where we focus our development efforts, because this is one of those things that we want to empower our users. This isn't for the developers of plugin developers or myself as a core code developer. This is for the users. So we want to collect information, what is needed, what's missing. There are some ideas that I omitted from this iteration. One would be inline maps. So in the XML, instead of saying use this data map, you could just say, I want these topics, and you wouldn't use them in all cases, but sometimes you might want to create a context for a set of topics where you don't, for example, have access to a map. Or you're given topics and a key map that doesn't sort of reference everything you need. So that might be one option, but then we get into the situation where we are starting to compete with the syntax that DITA offers, replacing it with our own, and we don't really want to compete with DITA itself. Same would be with inline filters, so you'd be able to inline the DITA-val contents into the project file. So you'd only have one file instead of needing multiple files. Don't know what Robert thinks about this. It might be a bad idea. We'll think about it. Variables, probably not. They would make it easier to write really complex project files, but that would be a cost we'd need to pay at some point because of the complexity. Then right now, if you combine multiple project files and you have definitions of the same things in multiple one of those, we don't currently have any sort of way of overriding things with a priority. Right now, the first one wins, and that's it. Some syntax sugar, perhaps. Syntax sugar means that in this case, for example, like if you have an array of things and you only have one item in that array, why not let the person just use that one item there? If it's not an array, then we assume that it's an array size of 1. And also, I suppose, those people who use sort of OT directly, you might want to use these with Ant or Gradle APIs of Ant. I call it an API. It's a way of running OpenToolkit. So to be able to use this with Ant or Gradle, but we haven't had resources to implement that yet. But Eero is interested in doing it, so hopefully he'll be able to do it at some point. But we added this to the DITA command, even though some people might still like Ant. The DITA command is the primary way of doing it. And we have a sneaky plan. Has anyone heard of Embrace, Extend, and Extinguish strategy adopted by Microsoft in the 90s? So it works so that you adopt a widely used standard, then start extending it with proprietary features, and with those proprietary features, you run the competition out and just take over the whole environment. Okay? We don't want to do that. But we're willing to take a risk by taking the 2 first ones. So we want to enable us and other people to embrace this concept, extend it, and then hope no one wants to kill off the competition. I might be an optimist, but I hope it might work. So, because project files are only partially specific to OpenToolkit, these could be rebranded as DITA Project files, because DITA spec talks only about DITA processors. An editor, for example, is able to use the context even if it's not publishing anything, because the context for an editor is key. You need to know when you're editing a topic, which map does it belong to, or which map uses it, which conditions are used for profiling. So these are very important facets of context. And if you think about the CMS, it has additional dimensions for the context. It has a dimension of language translation. It has a dimension of versions or change history. And using the same terminology as George did in his talk about instantiating the context, a CMS might have multiple dimensions in the context. They export the content, and then at that moment they hide some of the dimensions. They instantiate those contexts. And when in the end it goes to OpenToolkit, we're left with the 2 dimensions of the context we need, which is the map and the profiles. But with this idea, the CMS could sort of embrace it, start to adopt the concept of context being used. And if also editors can talk in those terms, maybe we'll get something better out of this for everyone. The exports from CMSs don't have to use this exact same format, but because OpenToolkit already understands it, they could. And the way we've set up support for these files in OpenToolkit is that if you have elements or attributes in namespaces that are foreign to us, we just ignore them. So if you use the elements that OpenToolkit supports, we're happy. Everything else we just ignore. So even if you're not that interested in project files, you're just here for Radu's and Georgie's jokes, I'd still try to ask you to think about this, maybe bring it home, start to talk to your CMS implementers, your editor implementers, to see if we could create something together with this, instead of everyone rediscovering and re-implementing the wheel. Thanks. There are no questions. Oh, well, there are questions, but because George will present about this same topic from a different view, I suppose what we could do is that if after that people have questions about project files in general, they could ask them then.
Okay.